This took place nearly 12 years ago, and to this day, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Over the years, I've had many other experiences related to my work in theological orthopraxy, but nothing quite like this. At the time, I was 16 years old and had gone to a friend's house deep in the countryside of the Boston Mountains in Arkansas. We had gathered to play Dungeons and Dragons with a group of 6 friends on a warm summer night. My friend's parents were veterinarians specializing in large animals, so their ranch had a vast, open space where the animals could roam and graze while receiving care. After an intense 8-hour D&D session, we decided to call it a night sometime around midnight. 2 of my friends, whom I'll refer to as S and G, and I took the guest bedroom for the night. This room had a glass door or wall that would normally open onto a second-story deck, but the deck had been torn down in preparation for a replacement. I was in bed, S was lying on a cot, and G had made himself comfortable on a yoga mat with a pile of blankets. Just as we were settling in, right before I shut my eyes, I noticed what appeared to be a flash of light coming from down the hill. The glass door overlooked a hollow that had been cleared, except for a few scattered trees. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a random flash of light, until S spoke up saying he had seen it too. That comment stirred G awake, and now the 3 of us were sitting up, staring at this pulsing bluish-white orb. It moved in a rhythmic, almost intentional pattern. Then G suddenly blurted out, "Holy heck, there's another one." Sure enough, a second orb appeared, mirroring the pulsing movement of the first. We kept watching, completely mesmerized, and over the next hour, more and more of these orbs materialized. Eventually, there were around 10 to 15 of them, all glowing and shifting in the same peculiar way. By now, it was well past 1 a.m., and we were still trying to wrap our heads around what we were witnessing. The orbs hovered at varying distances, some as close as 30 yards and others nearly 60 yards away. Looking back, what strikes me as strange is that we never felt frightened, cold, or uneasy, the typical eerie sensations you'd expect in a situation like this. Instead, we found ourselves laughing and joking about it, feeling oddly lighthearted, almost euphoric. It was as if we were high, though we hadn't consumed anything beyond cheap Harps brand cola all day. After an hour and a half of this surreal experience, still entranced by the glowing lights, suddenly broke the silence and said, "What's that?" From the far side of the hollow, we saw something moving, slowly making its way down before starting to climb up the hill toward us. The sheer size of it was staggering. I hesitate to even describe it because it sounds ridiculous, but the best way I can put it is that it looked like an 8-foot-tall goat man. Its eyes seemed to glow, and there was something almost ethereal about it, a strange, luminous beauty. As it ascended, the orbs around it shifted, parting to make way. When it reached about 30 yards from where we sat, it stopped, locking eyes with us for what felt like an eternity before raising one hand and pointing directly at us. Though none of us spoke a word, an overwhelming sense of calm washed over us. It was as if some unspoken command told us to remain still, to stay peaceful, and most importantly, not to feel fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the figure turned and left, disappearing back the way it came. The orbs, however, continued their rhythmic dance for a while longer before gradually fading, one by one. We remained frozen in shock, too stunned to sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, we dragged ourselves to breakfast, completely exhausted. The rest of the group immediately noticed and asked why we looked like we hadn't slept at all. None of us knew how to respond. We just exchanged glances, unsure of where to even begin. Over the years, I've spoken to both S and G about that night, and no matter how much time has passed, their reactions have always remained exactly the same. S is now a devout Catholic and thinks that what we saw was entirely demonic, and even the thought of it makes him not sleep at night. So please never bring it up again, is what he says. And G, he's a pretty hardcore atheist and says that he doesn't like to think about it and thinks that it was a shared hallucination. And then there's me who, honestly, I have no idea what it was. You may not believe me in the slightest, and honestly, I don't blame you. But if you do have any information on what this could have been, whether that be anything from folklore to aliens or whatever, then please do share it, as I am really desperate to find out some reference to, well, anything like this. Houses are very far apart except for a few villages, and this event would have taken place sometime in the mid-late 80s. And as has been explained to me by both my parents, it was around this time that there weren't any phone lines, just street lights, and really, that's about it. Now my father started working around the age of 9. He would go down to the villages or centers in order to sell or deliver vegetables, as my grandparents grew vegetables like lettuce, tomatoes, and more. He would very often stay out late, as he would be required to deliver vegetables to several restaurants. And one night as he was heading back, a herd of goats was obstructing the road. To put this into perspective as well, he uses a little carriage like the ones ice cream vendors tend to use in Hispanic countries. So he couldn't just scoot by, as his carriage was being blocked as well. But then from behind him, he heard a voice state, "How much for a lettuce, young man?" And when my father turned around, he says that he saw a 10-foot tall man who looked really skinny, bordering on malnourished with pale skin. He couldn't completely see his face, but he stated that from the little that he could see, his face was very sunken. The man was wearing overalls with a flannel shirt, a bandana on his neck, and a straw hat. I know that the description sounds very stereotypical, but again, this does take place in the deep country, like an hour away from any city or town. According to my father, though, the straw hat casted a shadow, and thus he couldn't see the man's eyes. However, he could see his sunken cheeks and crooked teeth when he talked. My father was obviously weirded out, but due to how young he was, in his early teens, around 10 to 13, he just sort of assumed it was a very tall man instead of something paranormal or something weird that he should have been afraid of. Thus, my father said the price, and the man paid. My father handed him a piece of lettuce, which according to him, the man was able to hold with one hand comfortably. As the man walked away with the lettuce, according to my father, the man whistled and the goats followed the man. My father then just headed home. If he did tell my grandma or anybody else like that, I'm still not sure if he specified everything. As I said before, this took place decades ago, and the area that this took place in was very isolated with no houses nearby. To explain the area a little bit better, a lot of oil palm trees are grown there. Thus, there are areas where you won't see a house for a few miles even, and all you'll see are just huge banks of oil palm trees. As for how he knew that he was 10 feet, well, it was a guess, but he states that he was as tall as the ceiling of the house that we were in when he told the story, and the ceiling was pretty high. My best estimate is that it stood at least 10 feet tall. Regardless of the exact height, one thing is certain. It was unnaturally large, far beyond what any human could or should be. I first heard this story a few months ago, but I only recently discovered this platform, so I figured I'd share it here since it has always fascinated me. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Growing up in the deep countryside, my family was no stranger to strange and unexplained events. Many of my relatives have claimed to witness bizarre occurrences in these remote areas. Are these stories true? I honestly don't know, but I find them intriguing and love discussing them. Several people have insisted that these accounts are real. If you're interested, I'd be more than happy to share more of them. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. I'm dealing with a very real problem, and I need help figuring out what to do. I follow Wicca, as do my roommates, though I don't practice much myself, whereas they are very active in it. I'll do my best to explain everything clearly, but I appreciate your patience as I try to lay it all out. Before I go any further, I want to clarify that I've spoken with multiple psychologists and therapists, and I don't have schizophrenia or any other condition that would cause hallucinations. I've done everything I can to rationalize what's been happening, but at this point, it's clear that there's something else at play. For as long as I can remember, something has been following me. I have no idea what it is, but at first, it didn't really bother me. Over time, though, the experiences have escalated, constant feelings of being watched, seeing shadowy figures, and discovering scars, bruises, and scratches appearing on my body with no clear cause, sometimes right before my eyes. I've also repeatedly heard my name being called by people I know, only to find out they never actually said anything, even when I was certain they had. For a long time, I dismissed everything, even when strange things kept happening, like my clay doll, which I had made to represent myself, mysteriously falling off the back of my shelf. It happened twice. The first time it was still intact, but the second time it shattered completely. Despite experiences like that, I didn't fully connect the dots. By sixth grade, I had started to realize that I seemed to be more prone to paranormal occurrences than most people, but I still wasn't sure what it all meant. Back then, I was really into creepypastas, and because of some of the things I experienced, I convinced myself that Slender Man was real and that he had chosen me to be his proxy. I know how ridiculous that sounds now, but I was just a kid, so don't judge me too harshly. A lot of what I went through was probably just my imagination running wild, turning normal events into something supernatural. But there were still things that I couldn't explain away so easily. For instance, I once read a story claiming that after reading it, strange things would start happening, and that Jeff the Killer would come for me that night. I know it was just a story, but the fear felt real. At school, my mind definitely played tricks on me, but that fear escalated to the point where I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed there the entire night. I had a knife with me, gripping it tightly out of sheer terror. I was so scared that I didn't even feel tired. I stayed wide awake the entire time. Then, right around midnight, I heard footsteps approaching, ones I didn't recognize. They came up the stairs, stopping right outside the bathroom door. Whoever it was tested the handle, and when they realized it was locked, they knocked. Being a terrified little kid, I didn't dare respond. I just sat there, frozen in place, clutching my small kitchen knife, unable to move. The person didn't leave right away. Instead, they paced back and forth outside the door for hours, until about 3 in the morning, before finally walking back down the stairs and disappearing. Of course, I know now that it wasn't Jeff the Killer or anything supernatural from a creepypasta. But here's what still unsettles me. Nothing in the house was stolen, no one was harmed, and there were no signs of a break-in. I was fully awake the entire time, and I know for certain that it wasn't my parents. So what was that? About a year later at my friend's birthday, we ended up playing some paranormal games, which I know is stupid, but again, I was a kid. The one that worked was Cat Scratch, but the thing was when somebody else was the main person telling the story, nothing ever happened. But then it was my turn to try, and when I told the story, the person who was receiving it and was laying on my lap ended up with a large red pronounced scratch mark on their back. Now they weren't deep, and it didn't hurt them luckily. But it was like when you scratch yourself, and it's irritated but darker. And they ended up lasting all night, and I ended up doing it to all of them, and then one of my friends decided to try it on me. And it worked, but not as well as it did when I did it. But it still worked unlike when they had done it to anyone else. The scratch marks lasted literally until the morning though, which wouldn't make sense if they were just accidental scratches. Also, the dogs were going crazy when that happened, which is a bit weird. Now the main thing that's always been consistent is the voices calling my name. I've heard them my entire life. The scratches haven't happened in about a year, but they weren't super bad or anything. They were just small scratches and, well, to be honest, easily dismissed. I mean, some of them were fairly deep, but not too deep. The main thing that was really weird, though, was that some left scars. For example, I looked at my arm once, looked away for a moment, and then looked back, and suddenly there was a scar that hadn't been there before. That always confused me, and I have no idea what that was about. One thing happened about a year or so ago during the pandemic, though, was when I was in the kitchen washing dishes. This was when I still lived with my parents, and suddenly I just got the urge to sort of look behind me. So I did, and there was this whole person. I don't know. Even right after it happened, my brain couldn't process what it looked like, but there was someone or something behind me. I just stared at it for a few seconds before turning right back to doing the dishes. It took me a moment to realize, but what the heck was that? I tried to rationalize it as being my brother, but when I quickly turned around again, nothing was there. At the time as well, I definitely was home alone. That was the first time that I ever really saw it. Nothing bad came from it. I mean, it didn't feel like it wanted to hurt me or anything. Sure, the scratches and the bruises and the scars weren't great, but they weren't that bad. They were just light, and really there was not much to them. The voices were confusing, I'll admit, but they weren't terrifying. The feeling of being watched was creepy, but it wasn't unbearable. This year, though, it's been very different. So I've always had a bit of bad luck. Just bad things keep happening, but this year, it has ramped up a lot. Like, I got kicked out in early December and barely managed to move in with my roommate. So much has happened too. My roommate's health has been declining badly over the last year, and doctors think that they've been having seizures. We've also had a lot of pets die this year. 4 rats, 3 birds, and a kitten. Some of the deaths were expected, like some of them were old, but others were definitely strange. For example, one bird was perfectly healthy but was found dead on the floor with no injuries. The cage was open. The water was empty, and the food was dumped even though I had just refilled everything the day before. I found out when I got home that morning, right at 10:14 when my roommate woke up, that this must have happened. But the heater got turned on all the way to hot. Now we don't turn on the heater. The heaters are always off because we have stuff on the heaters like actual things. Everyone here knows that it doesn't get turned on, and even then everyone else was asleep. I wasn't home with my roommates. They woke up and realized that I had left. One had slept through her alarm, and she had to get to work and be there in like 15 minutes. So they went and woke her up, and she raced downstairs and left literally no time at all. She goes up immediately and was gone. 5 minutes after they woke up, they smelled burning. And when they went to see what was going on, they found that the heater was on, and it was so hot that they couldn't touch it anymore. They went and looked at their thermostat in the room, and weirdly nothing had changed. They looked in the hallway and found that it was completely on hot, fully at the end as far as it could go. And it couldn't have been the cats because none of them ever jump up there, and plus, honestly, I don't know how they would even do that. Also, it just wouldn't have made any sense that they would have been all the way at the complete opposite end. I mean, it would have been somewhere in the middle or something. There wasn't anything that could have knocked it either, and really nobody would have. Even just the timing doesn't make much sense. I mean, it would have meant that the heater would have turned literally right on when my roommate got up because it takes 5 minutes for things to heat up, and 5 minutes after that they woke up is when they started to smell the burning. And because of all that, and because of how the only thing that could have happened was something turning it on like that, we were worried that maybe, just maybe, it was now trying to burn down the house. But that wouldn't make much sense, especially if it was the thing that's been following me, because it's never done anything that extreme. But then because of the timing, it just would have made sense for it to scare us instead of actually trying to burn the house down, which feels like a much smaller jump, but I don't know. I'm not even sure if I'm explaining this properly, but the day before this happened, my roommates had a strange experience, one that had only ever occurred once before, years ago, when they encountered a spirit that actually harmed them. Out of nowhere, every hair on their bodies stood on end, and they were covered in goosebumps. The last time they felt that exact sensation, they had an aggressive encounter with a ghost. And now it had happened again, just a day before this terrifying night. Adding to the unease, their altar, dedicated to Poseidon, I believe, seemed to carry a strange energy as well. They mentioned that they could sense agitation coming from it, though they weren't sure why. I've always wanted to understand what's been following me, but now more than ever, I feel like I need answers before things escalate. I honestly don't know what's going on, and I hope I've explained it in a way that makes sense. If anyone has insight or advice, please don't hesitate to share. I'd really appreciate any help. I've been considering sharing this for a while, and since I had some free time today, I figured I'd finally put it out there and see what others think. This story is fairly long, but I believe every detail is important, either to understanding what happened or to explaining my thought process and reactions. There's some necessary setup and backstory, so I appreciate your patience as I go through it. My family has deep roots in the Appalachian region, and I spent much of my childhood in the mountains of West Virginia. From an early age, I was taught to have a strong respect for the paranormal and to trust my instincts when something felt off. The rule was simple: if your gut tells you something isn't right, it probably isn't, and when that feeling tells you to leave, you don't hesitate. Like most kids in my family, I spent a lot of time playing in the woods. It was a common routine for us. We'd head out after breakfast with a packed lunch and explore all day, only expected to return home in time for dinner or supper, as we called it. We never brought maps with us, relying instead on the older kids to teach the younger ones how to navigate. Somehow, no matter how far we wandered, we always managed to find our way home. At the start of every summer, and often before we headed out for the day, my great-grandmother would remind us of the rules. There's no better way to describe them than that. Strict guidelines meant to keep us safe. These rules included things like watching for animals that didn't seem quite right, never whistling in the woods, ignoring your name if you heard it called, always making sure your group had neither lost nor gained a member, and most importantly, leaving immediately if something felt off. I can recall several times when we had to follow these rules during our adventures, but it was never treated as anything extraordinary. To us, it was just another fact of life. If we experienced something unusual, we'd come home and tell my great-grandmother, and she would explain what had happened, offering advice on what to do if it happened again. It was never about fear, it was about coexistence. These encounters were treated no differently than running into a dangerous wild animal. We knew to respect the unknown, but nothing bad ever came from these experiences. But that brings me to what happened in Louisville. One more point that I feel is important to the story is that I am 6'1", 250 pounds, a man. So needless to say, generally, people do not intimidate me or make me feel unsafe in any way. So it was the February. I believe it was around the July when this took place. I was there on business, and if you're familiar with the area, I was a few blocks from the Nulu area, but not all the way to Bardstown. It was in the middle of the day, and I had gone out to smoke in the parking lot. The parking lot was in no way isolated as multiple busy roads came together and snaked around the block. I had been out there for a few minutes and was on the phone with my mom having a completely normal conversation when suddenly the strongest sense of dread that I'd ever felt in my life came over me. I looked up, and there was a woman walking down the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street. Walking, though, isn't really the right word any more than woman is. She wasn't really walking in the traditional sense. The best way that I can describe it is that she was trying to make it look like she was walking, but her legs were too long. I don't mean that her legs were literally too long, but that's the best way that I can describe it. Maybe like someone learning to walk on stilts, almost. Her arms were wrong too, kind of like they would go from being too long to being too short or something. I also couldn't see her, kind of like she was blurry or not sort of rendered all the way. Mind you, it was not a hazy day or anything, and it was not very hot for July. I know that that may sound a bit hard to understand, but I don't know a better way to explain it except that I couldn't seem to bring her into focus, I guess. When I say, too, that I was overcome by fear, that doesn't even really do it justice. I have never felt fear like I felt that day. It was a fear that I didn't even know was possible to feel, like I was in the presence of some ancient evil that would make an encounter with a not deer seem like a nice picnic. This might sound hyperbolic too, but it is how I felt. I wasn't afraid for my mortal body, but almost like I was afraid for my soul. As soon as I noticed her, I was frozen in this fear, though. Part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move a muscle. I could hear my mom talking through my AirPods, but I had no idea what she was saying and couldn't process it. I stood there frozen as she was making her way towards me. I genuinely have no idea how long it was, but at best, I would guess a couple of minutes I stood there focused on her. She continued her weird attempt at a walk and stayed out of focus until she was almost directly across the street from me. I would say that there was maybe about 20 feet separating us, taking into account the two-lane road and the sidewalks. When she was almost directly across from me, she finally came into focus. She was just a little old lady, maybe in her late 70s or early 80s. Once I made that connection, my rational brain tried to tell me that I was just being ridiculous, and it was just a little old lady. I have nothing to fear from a little old lady. Even if she was crazy and tried to attack me or something, I could pick her up and punt her across the street if I needed to. But the instinctual part of my brain just wasn't interested in hearing that for some reason. When she was directly across from me, she paused. She turned to look at me and was kind of jerky in a way. When she did, her face was wrong too. It wasn't like something out of a horror movie, and I can't tell you exactly what was wrong with it, but it was wrong. It was kind of like one of those magic eye pictures where you see the 3D image when you unfocus your eyes. She smiled at me, and her mouth was too big. It was almost ear to ear, in fact. For some reason, that smile is what finally broke the paralysis too that had me rooted in place. And after that, I ran. I ran in the opposite direction and only stopped when the area was fully out of view. When I finally came to my senses, my mom was yelling into the phone asking if I was okay. She informed me that I had just stopped talking for a little bit and then screamed and she could hear my breathing. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, and I believe her. As I got a hold of myself, I told her what had happened and she asked me not to go back to the area anytime soon. Not that you could have paid me enough to go back there right away anyway, but I took an Uber to my hotel and I started making arrangements to cut my trip short. The next day, I took an Uber back to my car and had the driver drop me off directly behind where I was parked. I got in my car and started it and floored it to get away from there. I left Louisville in my rear view as quickly as I could. I have been back since then, but when I have to go to that area, I always go with a group and I avoid it if at all possible. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that night, but no matter how much I think about it, I can't come up with a logical explanation. I don't use drugs, I don't drink, and I have no history, personally or in my family, of any psychological conditions that could have caused hallucinations. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, and nothing like it has happened since. The only conclusion I can draw is that I encountered something paranormal, though I have no idea what it was. That's where I'm hoping you all come in. Maybe someone out there has an idea of what I saw, because I've been searching for answers and coming up empty. I've done my best to stay objective here, to keep my emotions in check and stick to the facts. Even though this is an incredibly personal and unsettling experience, I've avoided exaggeration or embellishment. That said, I know human memory isn't perfect, but this particular event is burned into my mind. I dream about it often, and even now, I can still see her clearly in my mind's eye. About 19 years ago, when I was around 19, I was camping in the woods behind a friend's house. I'm 38 now, but I remember this night vividly. We weren't far from the house, maybe 500 to 550 yards away, and if we took just a few steps in its direction, we could see it across the cornfield, which had been used for hay that year. We had a fire going, just sitting around talking and enjoying the summer night. Earlier that day, we had gone to Lake Michigan, and while we were there, we met a girl who lived nearby. One of our friends knew her from his job, so she decided to tag along with us. Since she was the only girl in the group, we all agreed she would get the tent while the rest of us slept around the fire. About an hour into the night, an incredibly bright light suddenly beamed down directly over us. Startled, we all jumped up in a panic, just as a strong gust of wind rushed down. The light slowly moved away, and after some nervous discussion, we convinced ourselves it was probably a police helicopter scanning for marijuana plants, having picked up our body heat and fire on its thermal cameras. With that explanation settled, we lay back down, trying to relax. But within 10 minutes, our hearts were racing again. Out of nowhere, the night was shattered by an ear-splitting screech. Before any of us could react, something heavy landed on the leaf-covered forest floor. Instantly, we were all on our feet, tense and alert. A creature, roughly the size of a wolf, began circling us at an incredible speed, running rather than walking. It moved so fast that we couldn't pinpoint its exact location. The girl who had joined us was now crouched in the tent doorway, while two of my friends had practically teleported inside, moving with a speed only fear could produce. Meanwhile, the rest of us remained outside, straining to locate whatever was out there. The only clear glimpse we got of it revealed fur that was a mix of gray and white, random patches rather than distinct patterns. It was unsettling, but what made things even stranger was the realization that the helicopter we had assumed was a police surveillance craft was still nearby. It hadn't left. Instead, we could see its silhouette blocking out the stars as it moved steadily from west to east, almost as if it were strafing the area. Minutes dragged on, thick with adrenaline, until finally, we assumed the creature had left. Even then, none of us felt safe, so we lay there for over an hour, listening intently for any sign of its return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and one by one, we started drifting off to sleep. By morning, everything in the campsite remained untouched, nothing had been moved, and there were no signs of damage. I decided to walk back to the house to grab some eggs and other supplies for breakfast. The only thing that felt off was the lingering sensation of being watched from the woods, but given the eerie events of the previous night, I chalked it up to paranoia. However, on my way back, from a different vantage point, I noticed something odd: 3 distinct, flattened areas in the hay, arranged in a nearly perfect triangle. As I stepped closer, an unusual static charge filled the air, sending a tingling sensation through my skin and making the hair on my arms stand on end. As I approached the tree line, an overwhelming instinct to turn back struck me like a sudden wave of dread. Roughly 250 yards away, a thin stretch of trees divided 2 fields. Within that narrow wooded area, I caught sight of something bizarre. A creature standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, appearing to be a mix between a dog and a large ape. It stood upright, but with an unsteady posture, swaying side to side as if maintaining balance on 2 legs was unnatural for it. The moment I processed what I was looking at, I didn't hesitate. I turned around and walked straight back to the campsite. Without mentioning a word of what I had seen, I focused on making breakfast. Going back to the house meant passing right by that thing, and I had no intention of doing that. Roughly 3 hours later, we headed to the house, and there were no more sightings or feelings. Now the next sighting was about 4 years later, while hunting family property about 4 miles from the original sighting. Sitting in the woods by myself that evening, I had a group of 4 does come in. I would sit back in the thicker woods, but I had a 270 sighted in at 100 yards. I had 3 lanes that were optimal for that rifle, but 2 years before, got a hard shot on a buck only 75 yards away and threaded a needle with a bullet, so I was very comfortable with any shot at this point. Anyway, the does were calm and moving slowly, feeding with no care in the world. After several minutes, the largest doe kept checking behind them, though, hearing something, but I couldn't. They all suddenly jumped at the same time and even crashed into trees trying to get away. I still heard nothing, and I couldn't see anything in the direction that she kept looking. But then I noticed a gray and white-haired creature moving in down like a canine hunting. When I got the first look, I immediately recognized it too. This time, though, I didn't have any anxiety, no racing heart, and felt completely calm, unlike the first encounter. It was not because I had my rifle. As well as the first encounter, I had my shotgun that I carried. Maybe it was the distance. I don't know. But it moved through the woods and almost seemed to be avoiding me, but also feeling that it knew that I was there almost. It walked behind the denser underbrush and would almost leap through the shooting lanes that I had as to try and stay hidden and not give me a shot, I think. Not that I was going to, as I have a strong belief that cryptids and paranormal interaction should be viewed and felt with strong actions, at least resort option. But it only made a very low growl, as it would have been entering the field about 75 yards from me. I waited around 30 minutes before heading in for the night, as the creature moving through would have kept anything from coming in. As I walked back, I never felt the need to rush or even look behind me. Coming into the small grass field that we let go over on the property, there once again was a rush of wind and a dark object in the sky, which I could see better this time as a sort of triangular-shaped object, but had rounded out sides like a triangle that was filled, and the sides were about to burst almost or something. It moved slowly the direction the creature moved, and then quickly disappeared in the opposite direction extremely fast. Now, the last time that I had an interaction with the same creature was about 3 years ago, but now 50 to 55 miles to the south. I was hunting the Allegan State Game area only a few days into the firearms season. Anyone that knows that area during deer season knows that it is filled with hunters from all over. I usually would go to the more difficult areas as the city people wanted to hunt 10 feet from their vehicle and not have to work for their deer. I was deep in the woods by the Swan Creek area, and the sun was just starting to set up to be able to break through the dense trees. I'm used to the weird and sometimes unsettling feeling that the area gives you, but today felt particularly strange. I hadn't seen any other cars on my way to the area, so I felt good about a successful hunt. As the minutes went by, I could hear a few deer moving in and was hoping that a buck wouldn't be too far behind them. It was cooler this morning than the last few, and it was easy to see one's breath. I started seeing breath from behind some berry shrubs that I believed to be the deer that I had heard and was excited to see them move through it. After 10 minutes went by and the breathing kept coming from the same spot, I started thinking that maybe there was a buck behind the shrubs and he can smell me or know something's up. But then the does all booked it through the opening by the shrubs and full speed ran through the woods. Something had obviously spooked them, but shortly behind them was a sight that I'd honestly forgot about, and this time had my heart almost exploding and my anxiety at absolute max. So I'm around 1,000 yards in dense woods with many hollows and ridges to get to my vehicle, and nobody hunting with me to try and get to me. Being the zone that I was in, I had my shotgun, but with what I have seen in the past, I wasn't too sure if I was safe even with it. I traveled roughly a 50, staying relatively slow as to not make any noise. As I waited by a tree and was listening and looking behind me, the woods suddenly became absolutely dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels running about, and no wind even. Some would perhaps think that this is good because you can hear everything, right? But those who spend time in the woods know that when an apex animal moves in, either the warning calls go off or it goes absolutely silent in the woods. I kept moving at a more increased pace, and I kept checking my phone for better service to call on my in-laws to head out to the area for assistance if I needed. I was maybe 200 yards from my vehicle, and I saw what I honestly thought was going to be my end. On a small mound about 75 yards ahead stood a creature on all fours. But this one was different. The hair was brown and black, looked to be bigger, and this time the front half was fully visible, and I could see that it was the same kind of beast that I'd seen each time before, sort of half wolf, half ape. And honestly, it looked something like a test tube baby of some mad scientist. It stared directly at me for about 5 minutes, and I was sure that the other was somewhere close watching from behind. Then a huge gust of air came through the trees, and the creature ran as if it was being hunted itself. I leaned against the tree by me inside and felt a huge relief wash over me, almost like a shower of protection. I opened my eyes and looked up, feeling that I would see the same thing as before, but there were clouds and an open sky. Then the clouds seemed to distort and get sort of morphed, kind of like when glass has a curve or a defect, and it distorts your view of objects behind it. And I knew then that it was another craft flying above the trees, and it was either a different one altogether or a different mechanism to hide, but being that it was daylight this time. Now for about 2 years after, I had almost ghost-like visits from whatever these things were. That's really the only way to explain it. They both would show up in the woods while collecting firewood or on a walk with my kids. I never got the same feelings I did the other times. I felt like it was a memory playing in my head, except they moved and did things that I couldn't really see them doing. One day, I had my dog with me, which I trained to protect my kids and wife at the time. He'd even attacked me when my ex took him in the woods on a leash. I put on a new hoodie and pulled the hood over my face, and he came after me, even called. His name didn't come him just when he was close enough to smell me that he finally caught wind that it was me. But he was not on a leash this day, and not even 10 feet in, his hair raises and he starts growling. He seemed confused as to why himself. Then that was when I saw 2 of these things 20 feet ahead. And now this is going to sound really weird, but I could sort of see through them, and then they moved as if they were made out of smoke or something. The dog lunged at one and went right through it, and it dissipated like a mist thinning in the morning sun. The other walked behind a tree and just never came out of the other side. It's been a few years now, and I haven't seen the creatures fully but keep getting shadows at the edge of my view that sort of look like them, and they keep getting close on both sides each time when I'm walking in the woods. The most unsettling part of all of this is trying to understand how something that once felt like a purely physical encounter, something I assumed was a cryptid or perhaps an otherworldly entity, has now taken on a more spiritual nature. It almost feels as if a presence, like a soul, has been following me. I know how insane this all sounds, believe me, but I can't help but wonder, could it have died? Was I the one it didn't manage to take? Or is it somehow protecting me, as if there's some kind of deeper purpose to this connection? Regardless, after keeping these experiences to myself for so many years and choosing not to discuss the other two encounters with the few people I still keep in touch with from the original group, I finally decided to share them. Maybe putting them out there will bring me some clarity or, at the very least, some relief. Despite how strange all of this has been, it hasn't really disrupted my life in any major way, aside from a few near panic attacks from sheer anxiety and the occasional sleepless night immediately following the encounters. At the end of the day, all I can say is interpret this however you see fit. I'm genuinely eager to hear what others might think about it. I guess I'm just feeling a bit lost, hoping to find some answers or at least a few theories that might help make sense of it all. More than anything, I wanted to finally get this off my chest, and I'm curious to know if there are others out there who've experienced something similar, something that stretches across decades and seems to shift in ways I can't quite understand. I've gone back and forth about sharing this story for what feels like forever, because, honestly, it sounds completely unreal. But since I really love this community, I finally decided to put it out there. Back in high school, I worked as a closing server at the local Pizza Hut. After shutting down the salad bar and finishing up mopping, I usually left pretty late. I had a habit of texting my dad when I was close to dawn, partly to let him know I was on my way home, but mostly to check if he and my mom were still awake. If they were already asleep, I'd take the long way home, driving down the old country roads. At the time, I lived on a dog breeding farm about 20 minutes outside of town. On nights like these, I'd take the scenic route, either smoking a joint, blasting music, or just unwinding. On this particular night, I did just that. I was driving along a back road, only 3 or 4 minutes from my house. It was a road I knew inside and out, one my school bus had traveled every day throughout my childhood. One thing to note about my area is that I live in the deep woods of East Texas, so most people who own property put their houses about maybe a quarter to half a mile back on the property and keep their exposed woods as basically a natural fence and defense as well. So while you can see a lot of driveways and in mailboxes, you can see almost no houses, just pretty much woods with chunks taken out. Now as I'm driving, I come upon a toolbox like the ones that sit up in the back of a work truck, smack dab in the middle of the tiny dirt road. I pull up to it and stop and open my door, stepping out but not away from my car. And as I take in my obstacle, I realize my headlights are not the only light on the road. As I sat there, I noticed a pair of small headlights coming up a driveway that ran parallel to the old toolbox. Immediately, I sat back down in my car, leaving the door slightly ajar, just enough so that I could slam it shut and speed off into the grass if things went sideways. Then, out of the trees, a small riding lawnmower rolled into view. Sitting on it was a man dressed in a full clown suit, complete with a mask, and resting across his lap was a shotgun. He turned his head, locking eyes with me through my windshield, and as he did, he slowly lifted the shotgun from his lap. Now, I'm as country as they come, and I know the feeling of not being welcome somewhere. The second I sensed it, before he could even raise that shotgun to his shoulder, my car was already in drive, tearing through the side ditch of the road. I tossed my joint out the window, sped straight home, crawled into bed, and never really talked about it again. To this day, I have no clue what that guy was up to. This was around February 2019, long after the whole killer clown craze had died down. Whether it was just some reckless kid or an unhinged backwoods lunatic, I have no idea. All I know is I'm grateful I never crossed paths with him again. Now in my early 30s, I find myself reflecting on events that took place between the ages of 10 and 14. Everything began not long after my family and I relocated to a new town and moved into a freshly built home. The house itself was relatively new at the time, and as far as I know, there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy about the land it stood on. Within a couple of months of settling in, I experienced my first encounter with sleep paralysis. I had gone to bed late that night, and about 5 minutes after turning off the lights and closing my eyes, I suddenly felt an icy presence pressing against my chest. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. Naturally, I was unnerved and ran straight to my parents' room for reassurance. My mom reassured me that it was nothing more than a bad dream and urged me to go back to bed. I tried to shake it off and return to my room. But as soon as I shut my eyes again, the same sensation returned. This time, it wasn't just a touch. It felt as though something was pushing forcefully through the center of my chest. The sensation quickly spread throughout my entire torso, and when I opened my eyes, I realized I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move or make a sound. A chilling awareness crept over me as I felt an unseen presence standing just to the right of my bed, watching me. Trapped in place, I spent what felt like an agonizing 5 to 10 minutes struggling to scream before finally regaining control of my body. The moment I could move again, I bolted out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room. That night, I refused to sleep alone and stayed by their side. Fortunately, I've only experienced sleep paralysis a handful of times in my life, but this was just the beginning. Several other unsettling incidents followed. A few months after that, I had another strange encounter late one night. My grandmother was watching over my brother and me while my parents were out. She stayed downstairs on the first floor with my brother, while I was alone upstairs on the second floor. From my bedroom window, which overlooked our backyard bordering a small forest and a river, I caught sight of something that sent a chill down my spine. A luminous, white figure moved silently from one side of the yard to the other. It had the shape of a full-grown man, but it glowed with an eerie brightness, and I couldn't make out any facial features. Fear gripped me, and I instinctively ducked beneath the window, hoping to avoid being seen. When I cautiously peeked again just seconds later, the figure had completely vanished. Panicked, I rushed downstairs to check on my grandmother and brother. They were both in the same room, completely unaware of what I had just witnessed. No one else should have been outside, which ruled out the possibility of it being a family member or neighbor. That moment only deepened my curiosity about the paranormal. A few months later, my fascination led me to convince my mom to buy me a Ouija board. Eager to test it out, I persuaded our babysitter, who was a few years older than me, to use it with my brother and me while our parents were out for the evening. We turned off all the lights, lit a couple of candles, and nervously attempted to communicate with the dead. At first, I remained skeptical, assuming that our babysitter was subtly moving the planchette. Yet, as it glided across the board, spelling out responses to our questions, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something, or someone, was truly answering us. We eventually decided that we were done with it and put the board away. Again, I just kind of laughed this one off, but I don't know. Thinking back on it, the frequency of these encounters went way up after this experience. The fact is that after that, I never really felt alone in this house, especially when I was the only one home. Fast forward to middle school, though. I was usually the first one home and would remain home alone for a couple of hours every day. I generally spent most of my time in the basement where the TV, video game console, and computer were. During this time, I would regularly hear kitchen cabinets slamming shut, but they weren't open to begin with, mind you, and dining room chairs being dragged across the floor. And I always felt as if there was something watching, like I said. I did at times wonder if some of this was just in my head, only for the thoughts to be validated by both my brother and a few friends that would come over at various intervals. But there was another standalone event around the same time where my brother and I were playing games in his room. We were both sitting on his bed, and to my right was the door to the hallway, which was wide open. The lights were off in the bedroom, and there was some tertiary lighting sort of coming from the hallway. Out of my peripheral view was, again, a fully formed person, a white figure that appeared to be walking past the doorway out in the hallway. And as I turned my head right, my brother to my left sneezed and blood came pouring out of his nose. Again, I saw just enough to be creeped out, but not enough to fully validate exactly what I saw. And the whole blood coming out of the nose thing was really random and weird. There were a few other events to follow, though, more or less the same as some of the stuff described above, but all of this came to a head one night, and this is also where I saw some of the most vivid stuff to date. I was 13 at the time, and my best friend was sleeping over. It was Friday night, and we were the only ones in the house at that point. We were on the second floor playing video games when all of a sudden we heard the cabinet doors slamming and the chairs moving. I was honestly used to it by now, but my friend got a bit freaked out and asked what it was. I'm paraphrasing, but I said something to the effect of, "It's those ghosts again." Are those ghosts? And this is when things got weird for us. Shortly after that, my TV just turned off. The room became very cold all of a sudden, and it was almost like the air became heavy. I don't know. It's hard to describe, but it took much more energy to get up and move around. We booked it from my room and went downstairs to the first floor. We calmed down afterwards and figured that we had just overreacted to what was probably just an odd coincidence. We then decided to go back upstairs to play video games. As we're walking up, it became very cold again, and we began to feel weighed down again. We ignored it this time as, again, we just thought that it was all in our heads. We got to my room, though, and turned the TV on along with the video games, and after about a minute or two, the same thing happened where the TV turned off. Only this time I saw what looked like what I can only describe as a floating orb or two out of the corner of my eye, and at that we again ran downstairs. Like an idiot, I tried going upstairs a third time, same cold and heaviness as before. This time as I approached the door of the stairs, I looked into my parents' room from the hallway. The door was open and the lights were off. And to the right of their bed, I saw an all-white figure standing with no torso or head. I again booked it downstairs, and at this point, we went into full-on paranoia mode. I tried calling my parents, but there was no answer. We were stuck at home feeling terrorized and not sure when the adults were coming back. At some point, we actually started, chanting or praying out of desperation, which I actually think made things worse because the air on the first floor became extremely heavy, and we felt the cold rush down the stairs towards us. I also started to see the same small orbs fly into the room from upstairs, only this time directly in my field of view. This brought my anxiety to the next level, and I finally yelled out and apologized for saying what I had said earlier. In a moment of raw honesty, I found myself pleading with whatever presence was in the room. I assured it that I meant no harm and simply wanted to coexist peacefully. I promised not to interfere any further if it would just leave me alone. As I spoke, I noticed 2 or 3 more of those small glowing orbs appearing, along with one significantly larger one, which was a deep shade of purple or almost black. They lingered in the air for several seconds, hovering silently. Strangely, as soon as I finished apologizing, the orbs seemed to dissolve into nothing, and the heavy atmosphere in the room suddenly lightened. My friend and I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Then, as if on cue, my mom arrived home about 20 minutes later, and everything felt completely normal again, like none of it had ever occurred. Interestingly enough, I never saw anything unusual after that night. The strange noises we frequently heard on the first floor persisted, but they no longer unsettled me the way they once had. My friend, however, seemed more shaken by the experience than I was. He later admitted that he felt an eerie sense of being watched for a long time afterward. While the whole ordeal was deeply unsettling in the moment, I can't help but wish I had a better understanding of what exactly I had encountered that night. I've never been one to believe in ghosts, but at the same time, I've also never experienced hallucinations, before or since this event. Years ago, while staying at my parents' house for a couple of months, I was taking their dog out to the front yard for a final bathroom break before putting her to bed. I must have been around 26 or 27 at the time. As I stood there, I happened to notice a dark figure standing in front of a tree. It was nighttime, so at first I didn't think much of it. The figure was completely black, featureless, and seemed to be wearing a wide-brimmed hat, the same kind my dad often wore. Naturally, I assumed it was him. Still, I found it odd that he was just standing outside like that, so I called out, "Hey, Dad," but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. I tried again, calling out a second time, still nothing. It just stood there motionless. Then I suddenly heard my dad's voice. It was coming from my parents' bedroom. That's when it hit me. Whoever was standing outside wasn't him. This was a complete stranger on our property. Before I could react, the figure bent over slightly and gestured toward the dog, as if calling her over. What happened next unsettled me even more. She was standing on the driveway, but instead of barking or growling, she started peeing right where she stood. Her legs trembled violently, as though they were about to give out beneath her. Something about the way she froze made my stomach drop. It wasn't just fear, it was like she was paralyzed. That's when I really focused on the figure and realized it wasn't a person at all. It had the shape of a man, but it was nothing more than a solid black silhouette. Without thinking, I bolted inside as fast as I could. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to turn back and check just moments later. The figure was completely gone, as if it had never been there. The only proof that anything had happened at all was the puddle on the driveway where the dog had lost control. Logically, I understand that my fear of what appeared to be an intruder likely influenced the situation, and the dog probably picked up on my anxiety. However, I was surprised that she didn't bark. Normally, whenever she's scared, she reacts loudly and aggressively. This time, though, was completely different. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any kind of supernatural entities. Still, I have to admit that this experience felt strangely similar to those kind of encounters. My best guess is that it was some kind of hallucination, even though I have no history of experiencing anything like that before or since. That explanation is really the only thing that makes sense to me. For years, I just dismissed it, until one Halloween, I was watching a compilation of scary stories and heard about the Hat Man. People from all over the world have reported seeing exactly what I saw. Even though I'm still skeptical about the paranormal, realizing that so many others have had the same experience gave me chills. If that wasn't the creepiest thing I've ever encountered, I don't know what is. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie, not something that could actually happen in real life. Honestly, the whole experience is a little embarrassing to talk about, but like I said, I can't shake the feeling that there was more to it. What really gets me is that the dog saw it too, and her reaction was completely out of character. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.